6. Knight f1. Bishop a4. Queen e2. Long castle. Bishop f4. Knight b3. h5. King b8. Knight e3. Bishop e7. Knight g4. Rook hg8. King h2. Rook df8. Queen e3. King a8. Rook e2. Bishop d7. Rook g1. Knight a4. Knight h4. Knight a5. Rook c2. Knight c6. Queen f3. a6. Bishop e3. Knight b6. Queen e2. Knight d8. Queen d2. Bishop a4. Rook cc1. Bishop d7. Knight g2. Rook h8. f4. Rook hg8. Knight h4. Rook h8. Knight f2. Rook hg8. Knight f3. Rook h8. g4. g6. f5. E takes f5. G takes f5. Bishop takes f5. Bishop takes f5. G takes f5. Bishop takes h6. Rook e8. Knight h3. Knight e6. e4. e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Knight c3. Knight f6. Bishop b5. Bishop b4. Bishop takes c6. D takes c6. Short castle. Short castle. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e3. D takes e3. Knight takes e4. Bishop f4. Knight d6. Queen f3. Bishop f5. Rook a d1. Queen f6. Knight g4. Queen g6. Knight e3. Bishop e4. Queen g3. Rook a d8. Bishop takes d6. C takes d6. Rook d4. Bishop takes c2. Rook g4. Queen d3. Rook takes g7 check. King h8. Queen g5. Rook g8. Queen f6. Rook takes g7. Queen takes d8 check. Rook g8. Queen f6 check. Rook g7. h4. Queen g6. Queen d4. Bishop d3. Rook d1. Bishop e4. Queen takes d6. Queen takes d6. Rook takes d6. Rook g8. Rook d7. King g7. Rook takes b7. Rook d8. Rook takes a7. Rook d2. Rook e7. Bishop b1. a4. Rook takes b2. a5. Rook a2. Rook a7. Bishop e4. f3. Bishop d3. h5. h6. Knight g4. Bishop f5. Knight e5. Bishop e6. Knight takes c6. King f6. Knight d4. Bishop d5. Rook a6 check. e6. Knight c3. d5. e4. D takes e4. Knight takes e4. Knight d7. Knight f3. Knight g f6. Knight takes f6 check. Knight takes f6. Bishop e3. Bishop d6. Bishop d3. Knight d5. Short castle. Knight takes e3. F takes e3. Queen e7. Knight e5. Bishop takes e5. D takes e5. Queen g5. Queen f3. Short castle. Queen f4. Queen takes f4. E takes f4. Bishop d7. Rook a d1. Bishop c6. Rook d2. Rook f d8. Rook f d1. g6. King f2. Rook d4. e5. Knight f3. Bishop b4. Bishop b5. Short castle. d3. Rook e8. Short castle. c6. Bishop a4. h6. Bishop b3. d6. Knight e2. Knight b d7. Knight g3. Knight c5. c3. Knight takes b3. A takes b3. Bishop c5. Bishop e3. Bishop takes e3. F takes e3. a6. Knight h4. d5. E takes d5. C takes d5. Knight hf5. Bishop takes f5. Knight takes f5. Rook e6. Rook a4. Queen d7. Rook h4. Rook a e8. Queen e1. Knight h7. Rook g4. Rook g6. Rook takes g6. F takes g6. Knight h4. g5. Knight f5. Rook f8. Knight g3. Knight f6. b4. Rook e8. e4. d4. c4. Knight g4. Knight f5. g6. Knight g3. h5. h3. Knight e3. Rook f6. King g7. Rook b6. Rook e6. Rook takes e6. Queen takes e6. Knight f1. Knight takes f1. Queen takes f1. g4. h4. Queen e7. Queen e1. b6. Queen g3. King f6. Queen f2 check. King e6. Queen f1. Knight fd1. f5. e5. D takes e5. F takes e5. Rook takes e5. Bishop takes c5. Rook e1 check. King f2. Rook f1 check. White resigned, black is victorious. g5. e3. g4. Knight d4. c5. Knight b3. e6. d4. C takes d4. E takes d4. Knight f6. Bishop e2. h5. Short castle. Bishop e7. c4. d5. Knight c3. Knight c6. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight e4. Bishop d7. Rook e1. Queen b6. Knight bc5. Long castle. a3. King b8. b4. King a8. Rook b1. f5. Knight a4. Queen c7. Knight ec5. Bishop f6. Bishop b2. Rook he8. Rook c1. Queen d6. Queen b3. Bishop c8. Rook e d1. e5. D takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop b5. Rook e7. Knight c3. Knight f3 check. G takes f3. G takes f3. King h1. Rook g7. Rook g1. Rook dg8. Queen takes d5. Rook takes g1 check. Rook takes g1. Rook takes g1 check. King takes g1. Queen g6 check. King f1. Queen g2 check. King e1. Queen g1 check. Bishop f1. a6. Queen d8. King b8. Queen d6 check. Knight takes e4. Knight takes e4. d5. Knight g3. e4. Bishop b5. E takes f3. Queen takes f3. Queen e7 check. Queen e2. Bishop e6. Bishop takes c6 check. B takes c6. d4. g6. Bishop f4. Bishop g7. Bishop e5. Bishop takes e5. D takes e5. c5. Short castle. Short castle. Rook a d1. f6. E takes f6. Queen takes f6. Queen a6. d4. Queen c6. Bishop c4. Queen takes f6. Rook takes f6. Rook fe1. Rook b8. b3. Bishop e6. Knight e4. Rook f5. g4. Rook e5. Knight f6 check. King f7. Rook takes e5. King takes f6. Rook takes c5. Rook d8. Rook takes c7. Bishop takes g4. Rook d2. Bishop f5. Rook c4. King e5. Rook c5 check. King e4. Rook a5. King f3. Rook e5. King f4. Rook e1. h5. e4. d5. E takes d5. Queen takes d5. Knight c3. Queen e5 check. Knight ge2. Knight c6. d4. Queen d6. Bishop f4. Queen b4. a3. Queen b6. Knight d5. Queen takes b2. Knight takes c7 check. King d8. Knight takes a8. Knight f6. Queen b1. Queen takes b1 check. Rook takes b1. Knight d5. Bishop g3. Bishop f5. Rook takes b7. e6. c4. Knight a5. Bishop c7 check. Knight takes c7. Rook takes c7. Bishop takes a3. Knight g3. Bishop b4 check. King e2. Bishop c2. King e3. h5. Rook takes a7. Knight b3. Knight b6. Bishop d2 check. King f3. Rook h6. Rook d7 check. King e8. Knight e4. e5. Knight takes d2. Knight takes d2 check. King e3. Rook takes b6. King takes d2. King takes d7. King takes c2. E takes d4. Bishop d3. Rook f6. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. e5. Bishop c4. Knight f6. d3. Bishop c5. Short castle. d6. c3. a5. Knight b d2. Bishop a7. a4. Bishop e6. Bishop takes e6. F takes e6. Knight c4. Short castle. Bishop e3. Bishop b8. Queen c2. Knight h5. d4. Queen f6. d takes e5. d takes e5. Queen b3. b6. Queen b5. Knight e7. Knight c takes e5. c5. Knight d7. Queen g6. Knight takes f8. King takes f8. Rook a d1. Bishop c7. Queen d7. Rook c8. Bishop g5. Knight f6. Bishop takes f6. G takes f6. Queen takes e6. Rook e8. Rook d7. Bishop f4. Queen h3. Queen takes e4. Rook e1. Queen g6. Queen e6. Queen f7. Queen takes f7 check. King takes f7. g3. Bishop b8. Knight d2. King f8. Knight c4. Knight g6. Rook takes e8 check. King takes e8. Rook b7. Bishop e5. Knight takes e5. e4. c5. b4. d5. b takes c5. e5. e takes d5. Bishop takes c5. Knight c3. Knight f6. Knight f3. e4. Knight g5. Bishop f5. Bishop b5 check. Knight b d7. Short castle. Short castle. d4. Bishop d6. Knight e2. a6. Bishop a4. h6. Knight h3. Bishop takes h3. G takes h3. Knight takes d5. Bishop b3. Knight 7 b6. c4. Knight takes c4. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes h2 check. King takes h2. Queen c7 check. Knight g3. Queen takes c4. Knight takes e4. Rook f e8. Knight g3. Rook a d8. Bishop a3. Knight f6. Bishop c5. h5. Knight takes h5. Knight takes h5. Queen takes h5. Rook d5. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. d5. E takes d5. Knight b4. d4. Knight takes d5. c4. Knight df6. Knight c3. c6. Bishop e2. Bishop f5. Bishop f4. e6. Short castle. Bishop d6. Bishop takes d6. Queen takes d6. Queen b3. Rook b8. c5. Queen d8. Knight e5. Knight e7. Rook a d1. Short castle. Bishop f3. Knight e d5. Knight takes d5. E takes d5. Rook fe1. Bishop e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight takes e4. f3. Knight f6. Queen a3. Queen c7. Queen e3. Rook fe8. Queen g5. h6. Queen g3. Knight d7. f4. f6. Knight g6. Knight f8. Knight takes f8. King takes f8. Queen f3. Queen a5. Rook takes e8 check. Rook takes e8. Queen f2. Queen takes a2. e4. d5. Knight c3. d4. Knight ce2. e5. Knight g3. c5. Bishop c4. Knight c6. d3. Bishop d6. Knight h3. Bishop takes h3. G takes h3. Knight ge7. Queen g4. Rook g8. Knight h5. Queen d7. Knight takes g7 check. King d8. Queen takes d7 check. King takes d7. Knight h5. Rook h8. Bishop takes f7. Rook a f8. Bishop b3. Knight g6. Bishop g5. Knight f4. Knight takes f4. E takes f4. Long castle. Knight e5. Bishop h6. Rook e8. Bishop g7. Knight f3. Bishop takes h8. Rook takes h8. c3. D takes c3. B takes c3. Bishop e5. King b2. b5. a3. a5. King c2. King c7. Bishop e6. b4. A takes b4. A takes b4. Bishop g4. Knight g5. d4. Bishop d6. e5. Bishop e7. h4. Knight e4. Rook hf1. Knight takes c3. d4. Knight f6. Bishop f4. c5. e3. Queen b6. Knight c3. Queen takes b2. Knight b5. Knight d5. Rook b1. Queen takes a2. Rook a1. Queen b2. Rook b1. Queen a2. c4. Queen a5 check. Queen d2. Queen takes d2 check. King takes d2. a6. Rook a1. Knight takes f4. Knight c7 check. King d8. Knight takes a8. Knight e6. d5. Knight c7. Knight b6. d6. e4. Knight d7. Rook b1. Knight takes b6. Rook takes b6. Knight b5. C takes b5. King c7. B takes a6. King takes b6. Knight f3. h6. A takes b7. Bishop takes b7. Bishop c4. g5. Rook b1 check. King c7. King d3. Bishop g7. Knight d2. Rook a8. Rook b3. Bishop a6. f3. Bishop c8. e4. c5. d4. C takes d4. c3. D takes c3. Knight takes c3. Knight c6. Knight f3. e6. Bishop c4. a6. Short castle. b5. Bishop b3. Knight a5. Bishop d5. Bishop b7. Bishop takes b7. Knight takes b7. e5. Knight e7. Knight e4. Knight g6. Bishop g5. Bishop e7. h4. Bishop takes g5. H takes g5. Short castle. g3. d5. E takes d6. Rook c8. King g2. Knight c5. Knight takes c5. Rook takes c5. Rook h1. Rook d5. Knight d4. Queen takes g5. Knight f3. Queen f6. Queen c2. Rook takes d6. Rook h5. Rook fd8. Rook ah1. h6. Queen c7. Rook d3. Queen c6. Rook 8 d5. Knight e1. Rook d2. Knight f3. Rook 2 d3. Knight e1. Rook d1. Rook takes d5. Rook takes d5. Knight f3. King h7. Rook e1. Queen takes b2. e4. b6. d4. Bishop b7. Bishop d3. e5. d5. Bishop c5. c4. f5. E takes f5. Knight f6. Knight c3. Short castle. Bishop g5. h6. Bishop h4. Queen e8. Bishop takes f6. Rook takes f6. Queen g4. Bishop b4. Knight e2. Knight a6. Long castle. Bishop takes c3. Knight takes c3. Knight c5. Knight e4. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. d6. Rook he1. Queen a4. Bishop b1. b5. b3. Queen a3 check. King c2. Bishop a6. C takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Queen e4. a5. g4. a4. b4. c5. Rook e3. C takes b4. Rook takes a3. Rook c8 check. King d2. B takes a3. Queen b4. Bishop e8. Rook c1. Rook d8. Queen a5. Rook d7. Queen takes a4. Rook f8. Queen takes a3. Rook b7. Bishop d3. Bishop b5. Queen takes d6. Bishop takes d3. King takes d3. e4. c5. d4. C takes d4. c3. d3. Bishop takes d3. Knight c6. f4. d5. e5. Knight h6. Knight e2. Bishop f5. Knight g3. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3. e6. Short castle. Bishop c5 check. Bishop e3. Queen b6. Bishop takes c5. Queen takes c5 check. King h1. Knight g4. Queen e2. Knight e3. Rook f3. Knight c4. b3. Knight b6. f5. Long castle. Knight d2. d4. Knight de4. Queen takes e5. F takes e6. F takes e6. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. Rook c3 check. King b8. Queen e3. Knight c2. Queen c1. Knight takes a1. Queen takes a1. Queen f4. Rook f3. Queen c7. h3. Knight d5. Knight h5. Rook hf8. Rook takes f8. Rook takes f8. Knight takes g7. Queen f7. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. e5. d4. E takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight takes c6. B takes c6. e5. Queen e7. Queen e2. Knight d5. h4. g6. Bishop g5. Queen b4 check. Knight d2. Queen takes b2. Rook b1. Queen takes c2. Bishop f6. Knight c3. Queen c4. Bishop h6. f4. Bishop takes f4. Queen takes f4. Knight takes b1. Bishop takes h8. Queen takes d2 check. Queen takes d2. Knight takes d2. King takes d2. King e7. Bishop f6 check. King e6. Bishop c4 check. d5. E takes d6 check. King takes f6. Rook f1 check. King e5. D takes c7. Bishop e6. Bishop takes e6. King takes e6. King c3. Rook c8. King c4. Rook takes c7. King c5. f5. Rook e1 check. King f6. g3. Rook c8. e4. c5. d4. C takes d4. c3. D takes c3. Knight takes c3. Knight c6. Bishop c4. e6. Knight f3. a6. Short castle. b5. Bishop b3. Knight a5. Bishop c2. Bishop b7. Bishop f4. Knight f6. Rook c1. Bishop e7. Bishop b1. Knight c4. b3. Knight b6. Knight takes b5. Short castle. Bishop c7. Queen e8. Knight d6. Bishop takes d6. Bishop takes d6. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes f8. Queen takes f8. Queen d4. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes b6. Bishop c6. Rook c3. Queen e7. Rook g3. h5. Queen d4. e5. Rook e1. Rook e8. Queen e3. h4. Rook g4. f5. Rook g6. King h7. Queen g5. Queen takes g5. Rook takes g5. g6. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. e5. Knight c3. Knight f6. a3. Bishop c5. Knight takes e5. Short castle. Knight d3. Bishop d4. Bishop e2. Rook e8. Short castle. Knight takes e4. Knight takes e4. Rook takes e4. Bishop f3. Rook h4. c3, bishop f6, knight b4, knight e5, d4, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, c6, bishop f4, d5, bishop g3, rook e4, rook fe1, bishop g4, queen d3, bishop f5, queen f3, queen d7, h3, rook a e8, knight d3, rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, bishop e4, queen d1, b6, knight e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, f6, bishop f4, king f7, f3, bishop c2, queen d2, queen f5, rook takes e8, king takes e8, queen e3 check, king f7, bishop d6, queen e6, queen takes e6 check, king takes e6, bishop b8, a6, bishop c7, b5, bishop g3, g6, bishop f2, bishop d1, g4, king a3, rook takes g2, knight b7, bishop b2 check, king b3, rook g7, knight a5, rook takes d7, king takes b2, c5, king b3, c takes b4, c5, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, c takes d5, short castle, bishop c4, knight bd7, short castle, knight b6, bishop b3, a5, bishop g5, knight b takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, rook e1, knight f6, knight e5, bishop f5, rook c1, h6, bishop h4, g5, queen f3, e6, bishop g3, knight d5, rook c5, knight b4, a3, knight c6, knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop e5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, rook b8, bishop c2, bishop takes c2, rook takes c2, queen d5, rook takes c6, queen takes f3, g takes f3, rook takes b2, rook c5, a4, rook c4, rook b3, rook takes a4, rook takes f3, h4, g takes h4, rook takes h4, rook takes a3, knight d2, c5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight g f3, c takes d4, bishop c4, queen d7, short castle, knight c6, knight b3, a6, knight b takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen c7, bishop b3, bishop d6, h3, knight e7, c3, short castle, rook e1, b5, bishop c2, knight g6, queen d3, bishop b7, h4, e5, Knight f5. Rook a d8. h5. e4. Queen h3. Knight f4. Bishop takes f4. Bishop takes f4. Queen g4. Bishop h2 check. King h1. Bishop e5. Bishop takes e4. Bishop f6. Rook a d1. Rook takes d1. Rook takes d1. Rook e8. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes b7. Rook d7. Rook e1 check. King h2. Queen b8 check. e6. Queen g6. Rook dg8. Queen f7. Rook f8. Queen g6. Rook hg8. Queen h6. King b8. Rook takes h5. Queen a1 check. King d2. Queen takes b2. Queen takes e6. Queen b4 check. King c1. Queen a3 check. King b1. Queen a5. g6. Queen b6 check. King c1. Bishop g7. Rook f5. Rook e8. Queen d5. a6. Rook h7. Rook d8. Queen b3. Bishop e5. Queen takes b6. C takes b6. Rook ff7. Knight a5. g7. King c8. g4. Knight c6. g5. Bishop c7. Knight f6. Bishop d7. Bishop takes f6. Queen takes f6. Queen takes f6 check. King takes f6. E takes f5. Bishop c6 check. Rook 3 g2. G takes f5. Rook f1. Knight g6. Rook takes f5 check. King g7. King g1. Bishop takes g2. King takes g2. Knight h4 check. King g3. Knight takes f5 check. Bishop takes f5. Rook e2. Bishop d3. Rook d2. h4. h6. King f4. King f6. Bishop e4. Rook takes d4. King e3. Bishop takes d5. E takes d5. Rook takes d5. g3. Knight f4. Queen e4. Rook takes d2. Bishop c3. Knight e2 check. King g2. Knight takes c3. Rook takes c3. Rook d4. Queen e2. Bishop f6. Rook f3. h5. Rook e1. h4. Rook e3. h3 check. King g1. Queen f5. Knight f3. Rook d8. Knight d2. Bishop d4. Knight f1. Bishop takes e3. Queen takes e3. Queen f3. Queen takes f3. Rook takes f3. Knight e3. Rook e8. King b2. Queen b6. Queen e5. e3. c3. Queen c5. King c2. King b6. King d3. King a7. Queen e6. Queen b6. Queen e5. Queen a6 check. King takes e3. King a8. King d2. Queen a7. Queen e8 check. Queen b8. Queen d7. King a7. Queen e7. King a6. Queen c5. b6. Queen d4. Queen h2 check. King c1. Queen h1 check. King c2. Queen g2 check. Queen d2. Queen g6 check. f4. d6. Knight f3. Knight f6. d4. g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. e4. Short castle. Bishop e2. c5. d takes c5. d takes c5. Queen takes d8. Rook takes d8. Bishop e3. b6. h3. Bishop b7. e5. Knight d5. Knight takes d5. Bishop takes d5. King f2. Knight c6. c3. Rook a c8. Rook h d1. Bishop e6. Bishop b5. Knight a5. Knight d2. Knight b7. Bishop a6. Rook b8. Knight e4. Knight a5. Knight g5. Bishop d5. Bishop e2. Knight c6. b3. h6. Knight f3. Bishop e4. Rook a c1. a5. Knight d2. Bishop d5. Knight f3. Bishop e6. Rook e1. a4. Rook b1. a3. Rook bc1. Bishop f8. g4. Bishop d5. Knight d2. Knight a5. h4. b5. Bishop takes c5. Knight b7. Bishop d4. Bishop c6. h5. e6. h takes g6. f takes g6. Bishop f3. Bishop e8. Knight e4. Bishop e7. Knight f6 check. Bishop takes f6. E takes f6. King takes a5. b4 check. King b6. Rook takes c5. a6. Bishop takes a6. B takes a6. Rook c6 check. King b7. Queen takes a6 check. King b8. e5. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. Knight f6. d4. E takes d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop e7. Knight takes c6. D takes c6. Rook a6. Bishop g2. Rook g6. Knight f3. d6. Short castle. e5. d4. Knight d7. Knight c3. c6. D takes e5. D takes e5. Queen c2. Bishop e7. Bishop e3. Knight h6. Rook fd1. Knight g4. Bishop d2. h5. h3. Knight h6. a3. Queen c7. b4. Short castle. b5. f5. B takes c6. B takes c6. Knight a4. e4. Knight d4. Knight c5. Knight g5. Queen e7. Knight f3. Knight d e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop e2. Bishop d7. Queen d4. Knight c6. Queen g4. Queen g5. Queen h3. a6. Rook a d1. Knight e5. Rook d4. Rook takes f1 check. Bishop takes f1. Rook f8. Bishop e2. b5. a3. Queen g6. Rook d2. Queen f6. Queen g3. a5. h3. b4. a takes b4. a takes b4. Knight d1. b3. c takes b3. g5. Knight c3. King g7. e4. d4. Rook takes d4. Knight f3 check. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes d4 check. King h1. e5. Queen e1. Bishop e6. b4. Bishop takes h3. b5. g4. Bishop e2. Queen e3. Knight d1. Bishop takes g2 check. King takes g2. Queen h3 check. Bishop a3. King c6. Bishop d6. Knight f6. Rook fb1. Knight e4. Rook b5. Queen takes c3. Rook c5 check. King b7. Rook b1 check. King a8. Queen d1. Queen e3. Rook b2. h4. h3. Rook hg8. Rook a5. Knight f2 check. Rook takes f2. Queen takes f2. Queen g1. Queen takes g1 check. King takes g1. Rook takes d6. White timeout, black is victorious. e6. Knight f3. f5. c3. Knight f6. Knight bd2. d5. e3. Bishop d6. Bishop d3. Short castle. Short castle. c5. Knight e5. Knight c6. f4. Bishop takes e5. F takes e5. Knight g4. Knight f3. C takes d4. E takes d4. Knight h6. Bishop takes h6. G takes h6. Queen e1. King h8. Queen e3. King g7. Queen f4. Knight e7. Queen g3 check. Knight g6. h4. King h8. h5. Knight e7. Queen f4. Rook g8. Queen takes h6. Knight c6. Knight h2. Bishop d7. Rook f3. Queen e7. Rook h3. Rook g7. Knight f3. Rook a g8. Rook h2. Queen f7. Knight h4. Rook c8. Knight g6 check. King g8. Knight f4. Knight e7. Rook h3. b5. Queen f6. a5. h6. Rook g4. Knight h5. Rook g6. Queen takes f7 check. King takes f7. Knight f6. Bishop e8. Long castle. Short castle. Knight b4. Knight c4. Knight takes c4. Rook takes c4. Knight takes d3. b4. Knight takes b4. Rook fc1. Knight c6. Rook takes c5. d3. Bishop f3. d2. Rook d1. King b8. Bishop takes c6. B takes c6. Queen b2 check. King a8. Queen b6. Queen d7. Queen takes a6 check. Queen a7. Queen takes c6 check. Queen b7. Rook a5 check. King b8. Rook b5. Rook d7. Queen takes d7. Queen f5. Queen h4. Black resigned, white is victorious. g5. Queen g6. Rook e6. Knight f5. Rook a e8. Rook e4. King g8. h4. Knight a5. Bishop takes e6 check. Rook takes e6. H takes g5. c4. D takes c4. Bishop takes c4. Queen c7. Knight f3. Bishop takes c5. Bishop takes c5. Queen takes c5. Queen e2. Knight e7. Knight c3. Knight c6. Knight e4. Queen b4 check. King f1. Short castle. a3. Queen a5. Knight d6. Knight c takes e5. b4. Queen c7. Rook d1. Knight takes f3. Queen takes f3. Knight e5. Queen e4. Knight takes c4. Queen takes c4. Queen b6. Queen c5. Bishop d7. Queen takes b6. A takes b6. Knight takes b7. Bishop b5 check. King e1. Rook takes a3. f3. Rook a2. Rook d2. Rook a1 check. Rook d1. Rook takes d1 check. King takes d1. Rook b8. Knight c5. B takes c5. B takes c5. g5. King d2. Bishop c6. Rook c1. King f8. King e3. King e7. King f2. Rook b4. King g3. f5. e4. e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight d4. Bishop c4. Knight takes f3 check. Queen takes f3. c6. h3. d6. d3. Bishop e7. a4. a5. g4. Bishop e6. g5. Knight d7. Bishop takes e6. F takes e6. g6. H takes g6. Queen g4. Knight f8. Bishop e3. Bishop f6. Long castle. King f7. h4. Rook h5. Rook dg1. Queen e7. Knight e2. Rook takes h4. Rook takes h4. Bishop takes h4. f4. E takes f4. Knight takes f4. Queen f6. Knight g2. Bishop f2. Rook f1. Bishop takes e3 check. Knight takes e3. Knight d7. d4. Rook h8. Rook takes f6 check. G takes f6. d5. C takes d5. E takes d5. Knight f8. b3. f5. Queen d4. e5. Queen b6. King f6. Queen takes d6 check. King g5. Queen takes e5. Rook h1 check. King b2. e4. e5. f4. E takes f4. Knight f3. g5. d4. h6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. g3. F takes g3. H takes g3. d6. Bishop c4. Knight e7. Bishop e3. Bishop e6. Queen d3. Knight d7. Long castle. Bishop takes c4. Queen takes c4. Knight b6. Queen d3. d5. e5. Queen d7. Rook df1. Long castle. Knight h2. Rook df8. g4. King b8. Rook f3. Knight c4. b3. Knight takes e3. Queen takes e3. Knight g6. Rook hf1. Knight f4. Knight e2. Knight takes e2 check. Queen takes e2. h5. G takes h5. Rook takes h5. Rook takes f7. Rook takes f7. e6. Rook takes f1 check. Knight takes f1. Queen e8. Knight g3. Rook h6. e7. Bishop takes d4. Knight f5. Rook h1 check. King d2. Bishop f6. Queen e6. Bishop takes e7. Knight takes e7, a6, king d3, e4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight fd7, d4, c5, d takes c5, knight c6, bishop f4, bishop takes c5, bishop d3, h6, h4, a6, h5, b5, a3, bishop b7, rook h3, queen c7, rook g3, king f8, queen e2, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, king f1, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen takes c3, rook b1, queen c7, a4, b takes a4, queen g4, rook g8, bishop h7, king e7, bishop takes g8, rook takes g8, bishop e3, bishop c6, queen b4 check, king e8, f4, bishop b5 check, king g1, f6, e takes f6, knight takes f6, rook e1, knight takes h5, rook g6, knight f6, bishop d4, king f7, f5, e takes f5, e5, f4, e takes f4, knight f3, g5, h4, g4, knight e5, d6, knight takes g4, bishop e7, d4, bishop takes h4 check, king d2, queen g5, knight h2, f3 check, king c3, f takes g2, rook g1, g takes f1 promotes to queen, queen takes f1, queen a5 check, b4, queen h5, knight d2, knight c6, knight df3, bishop f6, b5, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen c5 check, queen c4, bishop takes d4 check, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, bishop c4, knight f6, short castle, knight takes e4, knight c3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, d5, bishop d3, d takes c3, rook e1 check, bishop e7, rook b1, short castle, bishop f4, bishop f6, h3, rook e8, a4, rook takes e1 check, queen takes e1, knight e7, a5, c6, queen e3, bishop f5, rook takes b7, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, h6, bishop e5, knight g6, queen takes c3, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes a5, queen f5, Rook f8. Queen d7. Queen e1 check. King h2. Queen takes f2. Queen c7. Queen takes c2. Rook takes a7. Queen c4. Rook b7. d4. Rook b6. d3. Rook takes c6. Queen e4. Queen d6. Rook e8. Rook c3. Queen e5 check. Queen takes e5. Rook takes e5. Rook takes d3. g6. Rook d7. h5. Rook d4. King g7. Rook a4. Rook f5. King g3. King f6. Rook a6 check. King g5. Rook a7. Rook f6. Rook a5 check. King h6. Rook a7. King g7. Rook a8. Rook e6. King f4. c6. d4. d5. E takes d5. C takes d5. c4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight c6. Knight f3. Bishop g4. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. Queen b3. Knight takes c3. B takes c3. Queen b6. Bishop b5. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. e6. Bishop e3. a6. Bishop c4. Queen c7. Rook b1. Knight a5. Queen a4 check. b5. Bishop takes b5 check. A takes b5. Rook takes b5. King d8. Short castle. Bishop d6. Rook c1. King e7. c4. Knight c6. Queen b3. Bishop takes h2 check. King g2. Rook hb8. d5. Knight e5. King takes h2. Knight g4 check. King g2. Queen h2 check. King f1. Rook takes b5. C takes b5. Knight takes e3 check. Queen takes e3. Queen h1 check. King e2. Rook takes a2 check. King d3. Rook a3 check. Rook c3. Queen d1 check. King c4. Queen takes d5 check. King b4. Rook a1. Queen c5 check. Queen takes c5 check. King takes c5. Rook b1. b6. King d7. Rook d3 check. King c8. King c6. Rook c1 check. King d6. King b7. King e7. e4. e5. Queen f3. Knight f6. Bishop c4. Knight c6. c3. Bishop c5. h3. d6. d3. a5. Knight d2. h6. Knight e2. a4. Knight g3. g6. Knight df1. Knight a5. Knight e3. Knight takes c4. D takes c4. Bishop e6. Knight d5. Knight d7. Bishop e3. c6. Bishop takes c5. Knight takes c5. Knight f6 check. King f8. Short castle. Bishop takes c4. Rook fd1. King g7. Knight g4. Bishop e6. Knight takes e5. Queen f6. Queen takes f6 check. King takes f6. Knight f3. h5. Rook takes d6. Rook hd8. e5 check. King e7. Rook ad1. Bishop takes a2. Knight d4. Rook takes d6. E takes d6 check. King takes d6. Knight b3 check. King c7. Knight takes c5. Rook d8. Knight g6. Rook g8. Knight e5. Bishop takes c3. B takes c3. Knight a5. Knight takes f7. Queen b6 check. King a1. King takes f7. Rook b1. Queen c6. Bishop d2. Knight c4. Rook b3. Knight takes d2. Queen takes d2. b5. f3. Rook ge8. g4. King g8. h4. Knight d7. g5. h5. g6. e5. Queen g5. E takes d4. Rook takes e8 check. Rook takes e8. Queen takes h5. Rook e1 check. King b2. Knight f6. Queen f5. Queen e6. Queen d3. Queen e3. Queen takes d4. Queen takes d4. C takes d4. Rook h1. Rook c3. Rook takes h4. Rook c6. King f8. Rook takes a6. Rook takes d4. Rook b6. Rook b4 check. King c3. Rook c4 check. f4. Knight f6. Knight f3. g6. c4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. Short castle. e4. c5. d3. d6. Bishop e2. Knight c6. Bishop e3. Bishop g4. h3. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. Knight d7. Short castle. Knight d4. g3. e6. Bishop g2. Knight b8. Rook b1. Knight bc6. Knight e2. Knight takes e2 check. Queen takes e2. Knight d4. Queen f2. Queen d7. b4. f5. e5. b6. b takes c5. d takes c5. Bishop takes d4. c takes d4. Bishop takes a8. Rook takes a8. Queen f3. Rook c8. Rook b5. Bishop f8. a4. Bishop c5. a5. King g7. Rook fb1. a6. Rook takes b6. Bishop takes b6. a takes b6. Rook b8. c5. Queen a4. c6. Queen a2. Queen d1. Queen a3. c7. Rook c8. b7. Rook takes c7. b8 promotes to queen. Queen e7. Queen takes c7. Queen takes c7. Queen c1. Queen d7. Rook f8. Knight e5. Rook a d8. Rook e2. King h8. Rook a e1. Bishop g7. Bishop g3. Queen d6. Knight f3. Queen f6. Bishop h4. Queen d6. Bishop takes d8. Rook takes d8. Knight e5. King g8. Queen f3. Bishop e8. Queen g3. Bishop f7. Knight d3. Knight c4. Bishop takes c4. D takes c4. Knight e5. Bishop d5. Knight f3. Bishop e4. Knight g5. Bishop d3. Rook e7. f4. g6. Knight f3. e7. g3. Knight f6. Bishop g2. d6. Short castle. Short castle. d3. c5. Knight c3. Knight c6. h3. Bishop g4. H takes g4. Knight takes g4. e4. Knight d4. Knight e2. Knight c6. c3. e6. Knight h2. Knight f6. Bishop e3. Knight d7. Queen d2. Knight a5. Rook a d1. b5. Bishop f2. Rook b8. Knight f3. b4. g4. B takes c3. B takes c3. Knight c6. Knight g3. Knight f6. Bishop h3. Queen a5. g5. Knight d7. d4. Queen a3. Queen e2. c5. e3. C takes d4. E takes d4. d5. Bishop d3. Knight f6. c3. Knight c6. h3. g6. Knight f3. Bishop f5. Short castle. Bishop g7. Bishop f4. e6. Bishop e2. Bishop takes b1. Queen takes b1. Short castle. Bishop d3. Rook c8. Rook e1. Queen b6. Queen c2. Knight a5. Rook a b1. Knight c4. Queen b3. Queen c6. Knight e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Knight d7. Bishop b5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes c6. Knight takes c6. Queen takes b7. Rook fd8. Queen b3. Bishop f8. Queen d1. Knight a5. h4. Bishop e7. g3. King g7. Rook e2. Knight c6. Rook d2. Knight d6. Bishop h2. King f7. f3. King f8. King f2. Bishop f7. Bishop e5. Knight c4. Bishop takes c4. D takes c4. Rook a3. Bishop d5. Rook c3. Bishop f7. Bishop f4. King g8. Bishop h6. Bishop d5. h4. Rook de7. Bishop f4. Bishop f7. Bishop g5. Rook d7. Bishop f4. King g7. Rook c2. h6. Knight c5. G takes h7. King h8. Rook g1. Rook takes h7. Rook d1. Rook g7. Rook d8 check. King h7. Rook d1. King g6. Rook h1. d4. Knight f6. c4. g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. e4. Short castle. h3. d6. Bishop g5. h6. Bishop e3. Knight a6. Queen d2. h5. Bishop h6. c5. Bishop takes g7. King takes g7. d5. e6. Bishop d3. E takes d5. E takes d5. Rook e8 check. Knight ge2. Knight c7. Short castle. a6. a4. b6. Knight g3. h4. Knight ge4. Knight takes e4. Takes e4. Bishop f5. Rook fe1. Bishop takes e4. King b4. Queen c3 check. King a3. Queen d3. King a2. King c3. b2. Queen